Every other page is a mirror. By So Do Roses. Summary. The fairies of Wick Hills will take anything from you they think they can keep. The people of Wick Hills are willing to give up almost anything. Dot Sanders is not willing to accept this, and neither are her sons. This is part 1 of Love and Other Fairy Tales. I'm sure many of you listening are familiar with that series. It is very long, and I'll work my way through a bit at a time. I hope you all enjoy, and I truly hope I do the story justice. The rating for this fic is teen and up. The relationships are Logan and Thomas, Dot/Larry. Additional tags. Harm to children. It's not super graphic and it's not malicious, but it is there. Bullying, adoption, grossly incompetent teacher, ass-backwards child handling theories, self-injurious stimming, pinching, biting, small amounts of blood, panic attacks, mentions of dissection, existential crisis, ableist language. None of this stuff is super heavy. They're all 6 years old, keep in mind. Alternate universe, modern setting, alternate universe fantasy, changelings, fae and fairies, changeling Logan, and elementary school. Ask 3 people how to get to Wick Hills, Ohio, and you will get 4 different answers. A lot of the older folks said to take 93 south from Logan. The Adams boys, whose sole contribution to the local economy was to provide teenagers with highly illegal moonshine out of an ancient still made from an even more ancient engine block, seemed to think it was north of Nelsonville. Lila Quickle, the dentist's daughter, said that it simply had to be east of the Wayne National Forest, because her family had to drive through it to get to Athens, where her brother was going to college. This was in spite of the fact that the rest of her family said they drove north to Athens through Vinton Furnace. And Hazel Kokenauer, who nobody was really sure how old she was, because everyone who was alive could only remember her being old, insisted they were in West Virginia. You'd think this would make it so nobody could get anywhere, but really it just meant everybody got there a different way. The population was 500 humans on the outside, about 3 times that in deer, and about 5 times that in other things. Its 2 biggest streets, Main and Fletcher, were both about a mile long, and where they met in the middle of town there was a rusted fountain full of rainwater and probably tetanus. People asked how to get to the Wick Hills all the time, the phone company coming to fix a line, or the Sears delivery men trying to get a new washer to its rightful owner. The directions were always different, but everyone still seemed to find it just fine. None of them stayed long, in spite of the fact that they often wanted to. Wick Hills was beautiful in every season. Dense forest and hilly terrain as far as the eye could see, striking in the winter, lush green in the summer, and exploding with fiery, vibrant colors in the fall. It was an easy place to fall in love with. But the people of Wick Hills were standoffish and rude, they said, shooing visitors out the door as soon as their work was done, gruff and insistent. Some of the older people even whacked their guests with brooms and other household objects until they fled. It was common, almost expected, for these haggard employees to return muttering darkly about how nobody in their right mind would want to go back to such a backwards, hateful place. They hardly ever looked back to the dozens of tense eyes watching them go, and they never heard the collective sigh of relief when their trucks finally drove out of sight. The people of Wick Hills know something the visitors never learn, not unless it's too late. It's easy to get to Wick Hills, but if you stay for even a day, it's very, very hard to leave. Dorothy Marie Galloway was born in Wick Hills Rural Hospital in bed number 17 of 25. Nominally, the attending physician was Dr. Sherwood, seeing as he was one of only 2 doctors in the town, the other being the dentist. But everybody knew the only person anybody trusted to help a lady give birth was May Ann Gage, who had been the midwife to every mother and child in Wick Hills since before even little Dorothy's parents were born. The first week of Dorothy's life was an endless pass from the cradle of one set of arms to the next. She had 3 brothers and a father who were elated to have a little girl in the family. The only person who did not seem happy about Dorothy's birth was her mother. When she was old enough to hear the story, from her brothers' mouths, because her father still sometimes said, out of the blue, "You look just like her," and then his face would go pinched and pale as cream, and he would go out to the shed where Dorothy was not allowed to go and not come back for hours. Her brothers told her it was not her fault. It was theirs, for disregarding their mother's strange behavior as tiredness from giving birth as old as she was. They didn't notice her vacant staring, or her sudden tendency to scratch her hands, or the crumpled brown leaves that were scattered across the floor of her bedroom, hidden in her pillows, tucked between the folds of her blankets. Until one day their father came to check on her, and there was only a tree branch in the bed, draped in her favorite nightdress. "Mamma was a stock," said Dorothy. "No," her oldest brother said pointedly. "Mamma was a human, just like me and you. But the fairies took her and replaced her with a stock, and by the time we noticed it was too late." "Is that why I have to wear so many daisies?" Dorothy grumbled, gesturing to the pockets sewn into the sides of her skirt, filled to the brim with daisies, as well as bright red berries and a few cut iron nails with holes drilled into the heads, looped on a string. "We make you wear the daisies because if anything happened to you, we would be very sad." So Dorothy, her pockets full of daisies and honeysuckle berries, grew up in a house armed to the teeth against fairies. She knew every trick, drilled into her head practically before she could speak. She knew which trees were safe to hide under, and which trees she should never touch. She could turn her coat inside out while running in less than 6 seconds. She carried bags of dried field corn to spill if she was being chased, had iron pegs in the soles of her shoes, and bells sewn onto the hems of all her clothes. Dorothy lived down the street from Larry Sanders her entire life. The first time they met, she was 6 and he was 8. She told him her name was Dorothy, and he called her Dot, and she never answered to anything else ever again. Dot grew up loved. Even if she had stricter curfews, shorter playtimes, and always had a brother or a father hovering at her shoulder, glaring at anybody who came near. She thought, there are worse things than being too safe. She thought, if someone had been taken from me, I would be paranoid too. She never thought she'd have to test that theory. The morning of the 10th day after her son Thomas was born, Dot lifted the baby in the crib into her arms, paused for a moment, and said, "Well, that's no good." The baby seemed to sense her upset and started to fuss. She hesitated for a second, and then began to rock him gently. "Larry," she called down the hall, "we have a bit of a situation, dear." Larry called all the neighbors, lit the fireplace, and put on a pot of coffee. Dot moved the crib into the kitchen, put on her reddest shirt, and began to pull things out of the cupboards. Flour, baking soda, salt, measuring cups and spoons. From the lower cupboards she produced jars of dried shamrocks, red berries, iron nails, and tarnished silver jewelry. A dozen or more people showed up. Dot wasn't paying very close attention. They baked bread and filled bowls with salt. Some people went out into the forest behind the house and came back with their arms laden with branches. Rowan and hazel and red verbena, more shamrocks, and scrubby St. John's wort. Larry kept the baby entertained with his keys, and occasionally he and Dot made eye contact that became increasingly distressed as the day went on. As the sun began to lower in the sky, Dot took a deep breath and went to the fireplace. She held the iron poker in the fire and carefully did not look at the baby boy in the crib. The poker turned red, then orange, but she held it there quietly until it was white and glowing. When she went over to the crib, the little boy who was not Thomas, whose eyes were too wise and too steady and the unnatural color of quicksilver, looked directly at her. Dot ran the index finger of her free hand down the side of the little boy's face and pressed the poker to his shoulder. He wailed, so high and loud that every glass in the cupboards shattered, and Dot's ears rang, and the smell of burning sassafras filled the whole house. Larry scooped the little boy up from the crib, cradling him and trying to soothe his cries. Dot felt nauseous and slightly dizzy, but she turned to her open front door, already knowing what would be there. The fairy woman was too tall, her eyes too big, her hair too long. Her skin was the ashy, grayish-white of burnt wood, and her eyes were a blue so pale she seemed to have only 2 tiny black dots of her pupils, making her look slightly deranged. She did not speak, but she held out the bundle in her arms, and Dot calmly took back her son. The crying of the other child had set Thomas to shrieking as well, but Dot just held him as tight as she dared and bounced him, knowing it was as much for her own benefit as his. The fairy woman took a step toward Larry to take back the other child, and Dot moved in between them. "No," she said, and she was internally very proud of herself that her voice did not shake. There was a pause, in which the temperature of the room seemed to drop several degrees, and the fairy woman spoke with a voice that sounded like frost on seedlings. "Give me my son." "He is our son," said Dot, her voice calm and steady. "You gave him up. You can't treat a child like a toy. You were willing to let him go, and he deserves better than that." The fairy woman laughed shortly, though it sounded more like the sharp cry of a bird, and made Dot feel like she was getting an ice pick to the temples. "You are a fool, even for a human. This is not a negotiation." "You're right, it isn't," Dot replied. "This is our house, and these are our sons, and you are not welcome here." The fairy's face twisted, and she looked even less human like that, snarling and cold, her lips pulled back over sharp and glinting teeth. "He will never be content here. You are not doing him a kindness. You misguided—" "Get out," said Dot firmly. The fairy shrieked, and the wind that whipped through the house almost knocked Dot to the ground. But when the air stilled and she looked up, the door was shut, and she was gone. Dot exhaled slowly, her knees shaking, and some of the neighbors were grumbling about Dot inviting disaster. But when she turned, Larry grinned at her and crowded into her space, putting the boys' heads right next to each other. "Look, Thomas," she said gently, "this is Logan. He's your new brother." Logan and Thomas Sanders were not twins. Logan knew this. It almost didn't make a difference. Of course, everybody in town knew that Logan was a changeling. Gossip traveled through Wick Hills faster than you could drive through it. That was too big of a fact to be kept secret. Even if it were possible, his parents wouldn't have tried. Logan never felt unloved or lesser. There were people in town who did not approve, but Dot and Larry made sure every day to assure Logan that there was a fault in them, not him. It did not make a difference in how he was treated. The differences were in the small things. When Thomas threw a temper tantrum, the worst-case scenario was that he might break a toy. When Logan threw one, every house on the block woke up to spoiled milk for 3 days. There were household objects he couldn't touch. The fire poker, the garden gate, the rowan tree in the backyard. He could not wear the protections the other children did. Daisies made him sneeze, hazel made his eyes water, and the juice of red berries gave him a rash. But Thomas could, and as long as Logan didn't stray too far from his side, he was protected by proximity. This turned out to be no problem as the boys grew up. The neighbors said that Logan was Thomas's shadow, and this was long before Logan was old enough to understand that it was supposed to be an insult. Where Thomas shouted and careened through the yard, scraping his knees and staining his clothes, Logan could lay on his stomach in the grass and watch a caterpillar eat a leaf for hours. Where Thomas laughed, Logan stared, quiet and solemn in a way that his mother found endearing and other people found unsettling. Thomas made friends with anyone who would hold still long enough, but Logan's only friend was, well, Thomas. He rarely cried, and even more rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in full sentences, carefully enunciated, eloquent, and precise. Precocious was about the kindest way anyone other than his parents described him. Once, Dot knocked over a jar of poppy seeds, and Logan, unable to restrain himself, sat on the linoleum and counted every single one. By the time he was finished, it was 2 a.m, and his father had long since put Thomas to bed, as he loudly complained that it wasn't fair that Logan got to stay up and he didn't. But after Thomas was asleep, Larry had come back down, and both his parents had sat on the kitchen floor and kept him company until he was done. So yes, some things were different from actually being twins. But, thought Logan, who was 6, and very smart, thank you, these differences were not important. Some of them were even improvements. They did not share a birthday for one, Logan being 10 days younger, which he was eternally grateful for. They had very different ideas of what constituted fun, and as much as he hated to admit it, if they had to share a birthday party, Logan was sure he would never get a word in edgewise. It was at that same age that Logan learned that to some people it made a much bigger difference. Sadie Wagner was boring, which in Logan's book was just about the worst thing a person could be. She didn't like bugs like Mom, and she didn't read to him like Dad, even though he could do that himself. He liked it better when Dad did it. She didn't help him learn any new things like the teachers, and she wasn't Thomas. These were the traits 6-year-old Logan found valuable in a person, and Sadie Wagner had none of them. But Thomas had said that she was his friend, and that meant Logan had to be nice to her. When Thomas told him this, Logan protested vehemently. That means I have to be nice to everybody, he said, as though this were the height of misfortune. Because you say everyone's your friend. I can't be nice to everybody. I'd never get anything else done. Thomas rolled his eyes. I just mean don't tell people you think they're boring, Barry. It's mean. You keep saying that, but you haven't explained how. It's a value-neutral descriptor, not a judgment. Big words, la la la, I don't know what you're saying, said Thomas, gripping Logan by the shoulders and shaking him. Logan sighed and stared beseechingly at the ceiling of their room. It's not mean if it's true. That's also a mean thing to say, Logan. So, Logan had to be nice to Sadie, even though Sadie was boring. She was Thomas's friend. It was important to Thomas, and Thomas was important to Logan. These are the things that Logan repeated to himself as Sadie flung yet another crumpled paper fringe into his hair. They were in first grade now, and because they went to school all day instead of a half day, they had 2 teachers, and Logan and Thomas were, for the first time ever, separated. Logan had Mrs. Quickle in the morning, and Mrs. Cordray in the afternoon, while Thomas had them the other way around. The only time they were together was lunch and recess. After 3 weeks, Logan was finding this far more upsetting than he thought he was going to. Do you have all the 10 family photographs I asked you to bring in yesterday? Said Mrs. Quickle. Yes, Mrs. Quickle, chorused most of the students, all except for Bobby Bowen, who was ignoring the teacher entirely and gluing several small objects Logan couldn't quite make out to his desk, though the desk was actually Danny Hart's, who was in Thomas's class, and Logan, who thought Mrs. Quickle's insistence on all of them answering in unison was very stupid. Your assignment is to put the 10 photographs in order from oldest to newest. If they don't have dates and you don't know how old each one is, try to make your best guess. What season was it in the picture? How old were you? I'll come around and help you if you need it. Logan sighed and glanced at the photos. He started pushing them into order with his index finger, wishing the teacher hadn't already confiscated his book for the day after she caught him reading while they were going over the spelling words. His argument was that he shouldn't have to go over the spelling words with everyone else if he already knew them, complete with attempted demonstration, during which he covered his eyes and began to recite them from memory. Did not go over very well. You're gonna fail 'cause you're doing it wrong, said Sadie, leaning towards him across the space between their desks. We are putting the pictures in chronological order, Logan replied. It's not hard. Yeah, but we're supposed to bring in pictures of our family, she sneered. You brought in pictures of Thomas's family. That brought Logan up short. What? He said, wrinkling his nose in confusion. That doesn't make any sense. Thomas is my brother. We have the same family, Sadie. Sadie rolled her eyes and gave an exaggerated sigh. You aren't really brothers, dummy. You're a fairy. And Thomas and Mr. and Mrs. Sanders are people. I'm not dumb, said Logan, automatically, because that, at least, was a familiar insult. The rest of the statement, however, was giving him trouble. Yeah, you are, she sneered, because you didn't know they're not your family. You have a fairy mom and a fairy dad and probably gross-toed fairy brothers and sisters. Logan's hands were twitching on his desk and his ears were starting to ring. No, I don't. I would know them if I had a fairy family. That doesn't make sense. The Sanderses are just keeping you because you talk weird and they think it's funny. But if you're bad, they'll leave you in the forest so your dumb fairy mom can come get you. I only have one mom, snapped Logan, his voice cracking. Yeah, and she's a fairy. Mom is my mom. Mrs. Sanders isn't your mom. Falsehood! And as Logan shouted, the windows rattled. The room fell quiet. Logan Sanders, we use our inside voices when we talk to our friends, said Mrs. Quickle after a long pause. She's not my friend, Logan spat. She's telling lies, and I'm not friends with liars. We don't call each other names either, Mrs. Quickle said sharply. Go flip your card. But she... Now. Logan was so mad he thought his head might pop. His nails dug into his palms as he marched toward the front of the room to the hanging display where all their cards were held, and flipped his from yellow to orange. Orange meant no recess, which meant he wouldn't get to see his brother until he went home for the day. Logan glared at Sadie. Sadie smirked back. Logan didn't get recess very often. It was usually because of Sadie. At lunch, Thomas waved at him, but once Logan had his food, Mrs. Quickle came and pulled him out of line. Logan looked back at his brother and shrugged helplessly as he was led back to the classroom. Mrs. Quickle let Logan take his food to one of the art tables in the back and sat next to him. He waited, wondering why she seemed to think he hadn't been punished enough. "Logan," she said, in the voice grown-ups used when they didn't like him but were trying not to let him know, "why don't you tell me why you shouted at Sadie this morning?" "She was lying," said Logan. He didn't say, "I already told you that and you made me flip my card for it," but he really, really wanted to. "What did she say that made you call her a liar?" Logan bristled angrily. Nobody ever believed him. Nobody ever listened. "Sadie said my mom and dad weren't my real parents and that Thomas wasn't my brother because I'm a changeling," Logan said, trying not to sneer or slam his fists on the table or scream or tear his hair out or... He took a deep breath and let it out through his teeth. "And I called her a liar because she was lying." Mrs. Quickle pursed her lips, the way she always did right before he got in trouble, and the angry feelings were quickly becoming the loudest ones in his head. "You shouldn't have called her a liar, Logan," she admonished. "You already knew you were a changeling. That's all Sadie was trying to say." Logan started pinching the loose skin of his hand in frustration. "No, she wasn't. She said they weren't my family because she was being mean." "Logan," Mrs. Quickle said sharply, "what have I told you about saying no? It isn't nice to say no to a grown-up." Logan didn't know if no could be a feeling. He wasn't very good at feelings. That's why he had Thomas. But if it could be, he was definitely feeling it right now. Mrs. Quickle sighed, and this time she did genuinely look contrite. "I would just hate to call your parents again, Logan. It's only been a month of school, and they've already had to come in twice. I'll tell you what. It's Thursday. If you make it to the bell and your card stays orange, I'll only mark it as yellow for the day. And then if you're good tomorrow, you'll only have one orange this week, and I won't have to call your parents." Logan knew better at this point than to argue with her. He cast a sour look at the cardboard, with Sadie's, the very last one, green as it had been since the very first day of school. "Yes, ma'am," he said flatly, wishing with all his heart that he could have just stayed with his brother. Miss Cordray was a much better teacher than Mrs. Quickle. Logan liked her so much. Unfortunately, that didn't mean he got in trouble any less. Miss Cordray hardly ever made him flip his card, though, even when he talked without raising his hand, or cut someone else's answer off, or interrupted to correct them. Mrs. Quickle used words like rude and disregard for classroom rules. But Miss Cordray said things like enthusiastic and eager to participate. And Logan was smart enough to know those were just nice ways to say the first things, but they made him feel better anyways. But right now, it was quiet time, everybody doing their assignments by themselves, and Logan had to stop himself every few minutes from chewing on the end of his pencil. A few days ago he'd gotten a splinter in his tongue, and he didn't want a repeat performance. At the top of his paper was written fish, followed by a list of various things fish needed to live. Water was at the top, and Logan was trying to think of all the things he and his dad did to take care of the fish in the tank at home. The fish were Logan's pets, and the hamster in his and his brother's room was Thomas's. Sacagawea was supposed to be both of theirs when they got her, but animals didn't like Logan very much. The fish were prettier, didn't smell, and they didn't run away or bite him, so Logan wasn't upset about it. Well, he wasn't very upset about it. When he'd filled the page, he went to flip it over to continue, but Miss Cordray was standing up from her desk and walking to the front of the room. Logan panicked, because there were definitely more things that fish needed. He wasn't even close to done, but maybe she wouldn't call on him and he could keep writing if he was very sneaky? "So, now that we've had a few minutes, who wants to go first with their list?" Logan tried to sink lower in his chair as subtle as he could, wishing someone else would volunteer so he didn't get called on. Sadie's hand shot into the air, and she had that smug smile back in place, and Logan felt the urge to slam his head into his desk. Miss Cordray seemed surprised, because Sadie hardly ever raised her hand, but she smiled and called on her anyway. "Okay, Sadie, you can go first. Stand up and tell us which animal you chose." Sadie hopped up out of her chair like she was spring-loaded and flicked her paper out with a flourish. "The animal I chose was a toad," said Sadie, her voice ringing with delight. Logan froze. Miss Cordray's smile was looking increasingly bewildered, but she nodded encouragingly anyway. "And what does a toad need to survive?" "Toads need holes in the sticky, gross mud, which is where they live, because they're gross," said Sadie. And she wasn't even looking at him, but he heard a couple of stifled giggles through the room and felt his ears burn with fury and embarrassment. "Well, okay," said Miss Cordray. "They also need food, and everybody knows that toads eat bugs and worms and other gross things. Toads love bugs." More scattered giggling, and Logan thought of the insect guide in his book bag and silently fumed. "The last thing toads need is water, because they live by scummy ponds in the woods far away from people, because that's where toads belong." Several students broke into peals of laughter, and Miss Cordray wasn't smiling at all now, but she seemed at a loss for what to do. "Very good, Sadie. You can go sit down now." Sadie sat down, facing away from Logan, and her self-satisfied grin was visible even through the back of her head. "Does anyone else want to volunteer to go next?" "I wonder if somebody picked changelings as their animal," muttered someone, and the other kids erupted into delighted snickering. "Who said that?" snapped Miss Cordray, cutting through the laughter instantly. The room fell into uneasy silence. "That is not funny," she continued, and Logan had never seen her look so angry. "How could you say that? How would you like it if someone said those hurtful things about you?" Nobody answered. Miss Cordray let the silence stretch on, thin and tense, until she shook her head. "I think we need more quiet time. Get out your math workbooks and turn to page 12. Several kids groaned, but Miss Cordray turned a sharp look on them and they got out the booklets. "Raise your hand if you need help," she said. She went to her desk and sat down heavily. Logan got out the workbook, trying to focus on anything other than the bubbling pit of anger in his stomach. But no matter how hard he concentrated on plus and minus signs in front of him, the anger didn't go away. If anything, it got worse, got hotter and denser, until it was like a lump of white-hot lead in his chest. He glared at the back of Sadie's head, shaking with resentment and frustration. He didn't even realize he was biting his hand until he tasted copper. He yanked his hand out of his mouth, shoving it under the desk and out of sight. He wrapped the hem of his black shirt around it and continued the math with his other hand. After several minutes, something landed on his desk, a crumpled wad of paper. Logan glared at it for a good 20 seconds, debating if he should just shove it to the ground and ignore it. Knowing Sadie, she would probably just shout that he was throwing trash on the classroom floor. And in some deep, tiny, quiet part of him, he wondered if maybe Miss Cordray yelling had been enough that someone, anyone, wanted to apologize to him. He pulled the ball apart with his fingers, and there in the wrinkled paper was a picture of him. He knew it was him because nobody else in the class, in the grade, in the school, in the town, had pointed ears, even if the picture made them as exaggerated and as big as his head. He had weird round fingers in the picture, and it took several seconds of bewildered fury before he realized they were supposed to be toad legs. He heard a tearing sound and realized he had clenched his fist around the drawing so hard that he'd ripped it in two, almost 3 pieces. His hands were shaking, and he forced himself to move his head and look to the front of the room. Sadie was grinning, with her stupid, smug face and her stupid ponytail and her stupid, stupid normal human ears, and he hated her. Hated her so much it was like a physical presence, and Logan wished he could make her feel even a little bit as horrible as she made him feel every single day he'd been in the 1st grade. There was a knock. Everybody looked up toward the sound, including Sadie, who looked down at her own desk in surprise. It knocked again. And then another. Everyone was looking at Sadie now, in various stages of confusion and curiosity. Miss Cordray looked up from her desk. "Who's making that noise?" Nobody answered, but the desk knocked again, this time so hard the lid jumped. Hesitantly, Sadie lifted it up and let out a blood-curdling scream. She leapt from her desk, the top flying open, and there, next to her books and pencils and crayons, were dozens of croaking brown toads. Logan sat in the back of the car, refusing to even look at his parents or his brother. He had spent the rest of the school day in ISS, and nobody had even come into the room. The principal had herded him into it, shut the door, and locked it behind him. He'd been sheet white the whole time. As he'd walked from the office to his parents' car, Mom's arm wrapped tightly around him, he'd felt dozens of silent, terrified eyes, watching him until he'd climbed into the back seat and shut the door behind him. The collective sigh of relief had been almost audible. All the anger had seeped out of him like he was a sieve, and he didn't know what he felt, sort of hollow, like a rotten tree trunk. Maybe sad. He wasn't sure. He barely waited for the car to stop in the driveway before he was out of it, thumping through the grass and bypassing the house, shoving against the hot path sewn around the iron gate so he could touch it. He sat heavily underneath the young oak tree, on the other side of the yard from the ruin, that he also couldn't touch, and gritted his teeth against the tears so hard his jaw clicked. He'd never been so angry as he'd been at Sadie. He didn't know there was even room in him for so much feeling. But there was, and it had overflowed into magic, more powerful magic than he'd ever done. Spoiled milk was one thing. Burns on his hands from bumping the gate, sneezing for weeks when the daisies bloom, predicting the weather. Little magic. A little bit fey. A little bit not human. Summoning real skin and bone things? Or worse, if he'd made them? Slowly, he reached up and ran his hand along the slight, barely noticeable point of his ear. He knew his eyes were silver, and he was a little skinnier, a little paler than Thomas. He looked human. He turned his hand over to the bite mark. Red blood, but sharper teeth maybe than they strictly should be. Was he different on the inside, then? If they cut him open and looked inside, would he be all jumbled up, strange and alien, with his stomach and lungs and heart all in the wrong places? He pressed his hand to his chest next, to the thump-thump and the sense of pulsing blood, the sense that he could feel it moving through him, and it had never occurred to him until now that maybe not everyone could feel it like he could. Was that why he felt things wrong? Always muted and shallow, or intense as a forest fire, one extreme or the other, never simple, never normal feelings. Was it his brain that was a fairy? Or his mind? Or his soul, even? Did he have a soul? He hadn't heard Thomas coming until he thumped down into the grass beside him. Neither of them spoke. Thomas started picking grass, one blade at a time. When he found a suitably wide one, he held it to his lips and honked at Logan. Logan didn't return his smile. "Everyone's afraid of you," said Thomas bluntly. "Everyone at school, I mean. And the teachers. Maybe Mom and Dad, I don't know yet. I'm not, but I know you won't hurt anybody. You were just playing a prank." Thomas was usually so good at picking out other people's feelings, especially Logan's. It was a little strange to hear him be so off base. "But probably if you just don't play any more pranks, everyone will forget about it." Way off base. "Thomas, they're not going to let me come back to school," he said flatly. "What? Why wouldn't they?" "Because I'm a fairy." Thomas scrunched his face up in confusion. "I know that. I'm not dumb. You've always been a fairy." "Not like this," thought Logan. "You don't get it," snapped Logan, "and I'm not explaining it to you." Thomas's expression turned to hurt. "But you always explain things to me, and I explain other things to you. That's why we're brothers, so we can explain things to each other." "I'm not your brother." Logan regretted the words as soon as they were out of his mouth, but it wasn't like he could take them back. They were true. What? "I'm not," Logan repeated flatly. "I'm not even human. I'm not a person. I'm a fairy with fairy parents and brothers and sisters. I'm a freak." There was a broken sob, and Logan's head snapped up. Fat tears were rolling down Thomas's face, looking both furious and like Logan had told him Christmas was canceled forever. What?" said Logan. "How could you say that?" sobbed Thomas. You may have a fairy mom, but I only have one brother, you jerk." Thomas shoved him. Logan shoved him back. "You're a jerk. I am not a jerk. You're a jerk. None of this would have happened if you hadn't decided to prank Sadie just because you don't like her. The rage filled Logan back up so quickly that every bit of it spilled out of his mouth in a scream. Falsehood! The tree branches shook with the force of his voice. His breath hitched, and then he was sobbing. Logan? Logan cried harder. Logan, I'm sorry. Sadie said I'm not a person, said Logan miserably. She called me a toad and made a mean drawing of me, and I don't know what happened. I just got really angry, and then the toads were there. I didn't do it on purpose. Once he'd started talking, he couldn't seem to stop. And now everybody's scared of me because I'm a freak, and you don't like me anymore because you like Sadie better than me, and I miss you every day at school, and you don't even care, and Mom and Dad are going to probably leave me in the forest, and I don't want a fairy mom. Barry, we gotta have calm down time. Logan reached forward blindly, and Thomas grabbed his hands, squeezing them until they felt almost swollen. Logan squeezed back, and they sat under the shade of the oak until both their sobs subsided into little hiccups. Logan let go first, wrinkling his nose at the tacky feeling on his face. He tried to clean it with his sleeve, but that just made his sleeve dirty, which didn't make him any less upset. I don't think you should have put toads in Sadie's desk. Logan stared at Thomas incredulously. Thomas grinned, at odds with his red eyes and sticky face. I think you should have put a possum in her desk. Mom! Dad! Shouted Thomas as he barreled through the back door, Logan following slower behind him. I'm going to put a possum in Sadie's desk. You're not supposed to tell people. Whoa, we are not doing that, said Dad. That is a big old fat heck no on possums in Sadie Wagner's desk. He smiled encouragingly at Logan, who arranged his face in a smile back. Dad grinned wider, and Logan let out a sigh of relief. You and me, Tommy Bug, he continued, need to have a talk about what give him space means. Give it up, Larry. He takes after me, said Mom, and she leaned down into Logan's face with a wet cloth held out in question. Logan lifted his face obediently, and she wiped the tears and boogers off of him. He held up his sleeve, and she sighed good-naturedly. Someday I'm going to get all three of you to stop using your clothes as napkins. Dad pressed his hand to his chest, outraged. Dot, darling, how dare you accuse me of such classlessness in my own home? Very easily, said Mom, but she was smiling. She threw the gross rag at him, and Dad eeped and jumped out of the way. All right, that's it. Everybody gets washed up. Hands, faces, new clothes, the whole 9 yards. We're just going to get dirty again before bedtime, complained Thomas. And you'll do it again at bedtime, said Mom. Up, go, march. But, Mom, I don't see marching. Up we go, exclaimed Dad, grabbing Thomas around the middle and carrying him under his arm like a basketball. Mom held out her hand for Logan to take. You too, Logan Barry. Ignoring her hand entirely, Logan threw his arms around her, resting his head on her middle. I love you, Mom, he said, squeezing once and then letting go. Mom touched his face with her fingertip. I love you too, sweetie. Logan felt something inside him, like he'd been making a fist in his heart all day, finally relax. That's the end of Every Other Page is a Mirror by So Do Roses.